And you can press next and back.
Okay.
Yep.
So, thanks, Ron. So, these ideas came from a guy called Matthew Siegel, you know, and a lot of the material came from Matthew Siegel. He's a very bright guy at CLSA, the big Asian investment bank. And so I asked permission, you know, from Matthew to take a lot of his material and put it in this presentation. And obviously I sent the presentation to him to make sure he was happy with it. And, you know, his work's, you know, really been inspiration. And he writes something weekly or bi-weekly called Hello Investors. And, you know, if you're an investor in global stocks, he's a great guy to deal with. So, basically the focus here is talking about, you know, what's happened with free open markets since changes to enforcement of anti-monopoly law in the early 80s, and sometimes I might say antitrust, which is the American term for anti-monopoly. So it's not an Australian term, but you might hear me use it. So the thing Matthew sort of focused on was there was rising inequality in the US, but really, so what? You know, I mean, when the Gini coefficient is 0, everybody's perfectly paid, like in a communist country where, you know, everybody pretends to get paid and you pretend to work. And you can see from, you know, basically the late 70s, there's been rising inequality in the States, but really, so what? If the rich are getting richer, you know, why would that necessarily be a bad thing at all? And you can see from 1980 to 2012, the top 1/100th of 1% increased their income, you know, by 431%, whereas the bottom 90%, you know, saw about a negative 6% drop in their real income. But again, so what? You go through cycles. But sometimes it might be because the way capitalism is working in a market might be becoming dysfunctional. And what's been bizarre is really post-war productivity and real median family income in the United States ran together until the sort of early mid-'80s. When we see productivity rising and real median family income, you know, just flatlining, and you can see real GDP per capita, you know, since the early 80s has been rising in the States, but real median weekly earnings of full-time workers is, again, flatlined. And I focus on the US because I think a lot of big moves in ideology come out of the States, you know, for good or for bad. Last night was, you know, the terrible tragedy in Las Vegas. You know, the obsession with guns is obviously not a great thing. So there are many potential causes for this rising inequality. You know, in the US, globalization brought lots of people into the global workforce, increased living standards worldwide. And that had an effect on a lot of semi-skilled, unskilled jobs in the United States that were protected previously before the Berlin Wall came down and all these people were liberated from communism. Technology always has an effect, but the big internet boom only began in the late 90s. Perhaps Americans were simply inefficient. I mean, you know, a lot of guys working on the assembly lines in Detroit we're doing a job where they got a middle-class wage for something that was pretty much semi-skilled and you can learn in 4 days. So, you know, really was that a middle-class job? And once they came into competition with the rest of the world, turned out perhaps not. And, of course, the effect of the rise of Japan and the rest of East Asia had a influence on American industry. But something else began in the early 1980s, which neither the right nor the left, until very recently, ever talked about, and that was an explosion of mergers and takeovers from the early 80s. And there's been an amazing, rise in the concentration of ownership. I mean, you can see there used to be 50 big media companies, now there's 6. In 1995, you weren't supposed to have more than 40 radio stations. Now Clear Channel's got 1,200. They used to block mergers in the beer industry if the market share went anything like 7%, and now 2 companies effectively have 80%. In the United States. In the food industry, you can see all the independent companies that once existed that are now in the hands of these big branded players. And again, none of this is necessarily negative. In defence, there used to be roughly in 1980s, roughly 36 big defence companies, now 5. There used to be 30 seed firms. There's now 6, but it's coming down to 3 very quickly. So, the level of concentration of ownership after all these mergers and takeovers is quite amazing. And actually, it's most major US industries. You can see that the trend is continuing. And in Australia, it's actually much worse than the United States. Well, when I say worse, it's more concentrated. It's not necessarily worse. Does it matter? Well, from the Democratic side, you've got the senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, who is a Harvard professor and has done a lot of work in consumer protection. And she feels it matters, and she uses the example of, the banking industry in the States. Back in the early 90s, the 10 largest firms in the United States in finance controlled about 10% of the financial assets of the United States. Today, the 10 largest firms, manage about 80% of the financial assets in the United States. And as she said, it's been takeover after takeover, merger after merger. Glass-Steagall disappeared under Clinton. The investment banks and the commercial banks started to merge. And does it matter? Well, did we have a global financial crisis by accident, or was that really too much risk-taking by systemically important institutions? And in terms of when you get economic concentration, political power goes along with economic concentration. And what's been amazing since the global financial crisis is that in Iceland, a country whose banks collapsed, literally and were nationalised, with a population of something like Canberra, there's been more civil and criminal cases against bankers than in New York and London combined. So, has that got anything to do with the fact that the former senior partner of Goldman Sachs was Treasury Secretary of the global financial crisis? AIG got bailed out. They'd sold a lot of options to Goldman Sachs, and without AIG having been bailed out, Goldman Sachs would have been imperiled. So, perhaps there's a link between, economic concentration and political influence. I'll leave you to make, your own judgment. The other thing that's happened is that you've seen in the States suspiciously sticky profit margins. And you might say to me, but Brad, look at that drop in profit. But that was the banks, declaring those massive write-offs after the 2008 crisis. And it's just interesting that despite weak demand post the global financial crisis, profit margins have stayed very high, which is normally a signal of monopolistic or oligopolies operating, in the market. And Labor's share of national income in the United States has obviously been falling, and again is having trouble rising. And it's not just Democrats like Elizabeth Warren who have started to raise questions about the concentration of ownership in the United States. I mean, Steve Forbes, made the comment last week to Raymond James that he doesn't see there are any. He doesn't believe there are really free markets in American healthcare anymore. And he quoted, you go to one hospital and it's $1,400 for a treatment, $7,300 at another hospital for the same treatment. And, his belief is that this is not exactly creating an environment to foster medical breakthroughs. And if we go back to those sticky corporate profit margins, Goldman Sachs is saying, well, if you have, elevated corporate profit margins despite weak demand, there are broader questions to ask about how capitalism is working in the States. Feelings echoed by The Economist, who I guess are centre of the road politically, just believing that there should be more competition, and the return on profits are obviously very rewarding at the moment. And incredibly, someone else who's considered very right-wing, Steve Bannon, who was recently kicked out of the White House, thinks that Facebook and Google are just like railroads or telecom monopolies and should be regulated as such. So it's quite interesting that you've got Elizabeth Warren, who's a Democrat, Steve Forbes, who's obviously an incredibly successful business family, Steve Bannon, who's on the populist right, Goldman Sachs, the investment bank, starting to raise questions. And, I sort of pose the questions, but this is amazing that Americans, actually, if you look at the history of the Boston Tea Party, that was a question of the British East India Company, a multinational with a standing army of 70,000 troops that had conquered India, had a monopoly on Indian trade, and in 1773 had tons and tons of tea piling up in the London docks they couldn't sell. And despite the fact they were that same year given the opium monopoly in Bengal, which they'd shortly shipped to China, which, as I say, charming, sort of act of charity towards the Chinese people. the British East India Company were essentially given the right to import tea into the United States, and unlike all the other colonial importers, they would get a tax refund. So clearly, the British East India Company would be able to sell here net of tax, and every other colonial would be selling there and be wiped out. And if you're sitting there as an American, seeing somebody who has conquered India, has their own standing army, and within a generation, the standing army of the British East India Company was twice as big as the British Army. You sort of say, well, they've been given that monopoly, it's not going to be the end, is it? And it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience for the Indians, having the British East India Company walking all over them. So the reaction was the Boston Tea Party. 40 tonnes of tea go into the harbour of Boston. And, people, what they've probably done, Americans compared to us are quite revolutionary, but you've got to look at their history, and that is really that from the Mayflower in the sort of early 17th century, 1630 odd, and until, well after the War of Independence, between half to two-thirds of white immigrants to the United States were indentured servants. So they go down to the dock in Bristol or London, aged 14 to 25, and sell themselves to the master of a vessel, who would then cut them across the Atlantic and sell them into indentured servitude for 4 to 7 years in the United States, and that's how they paid for their passage. So they were, I wouldn't say white slaves, they volunteered for it, but they couldn't get married without permission from the master. If they ran away, they were tracked like a slave in return, often beaten. If a female indentured servant got pregnant, her pregnancy was added to the 4 to 7 years. So, you had half to two-thirds of these people and or their ancestors with this, memory of debt bondage. So, they weren't too keen about the monopoly. And, of course, some 18 months later, the first shots were fired at Lexington. And then, mid-century, they fought a terrible civil war, so all Americans could trade their labour freely. And, people forget about American civil wars, and more Americans died in that war than every other war the Americans fought until Vietnam. And then after the war, there was massive industrialisation. Naturally, very successful businessmen like Carnegie and Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, were able to, build monopolies. They were efficient, but sometimes, people like what we used to call robber barons, Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, with railroads leading to New York City, could say to, a company like Bluestone, which was a building materials company, supplying all the materials for the rising skyscrapers of New York in the 1880s and 1890s, we're not going to carry your freight anymore. So why don't you sell the company to us and knock down price? And out of that came, a line of legislation which was the Sherman Act, in 1890, and then a series of acts, the Clayton Act under Woodrow Wilson, and then, a number of different pieces of legislation during the Depression. And Woodrow Wilson, when he was elected in 1912, he did a lot of things I don't agree with, but what he did do was probably saved America from domination by socialists and by, monopolistic plutocrats who wanted to establish, basically dynastic, family rule. And he believed competition is the best form of regulation, which is why Ron thought that was the best title for the presentation, and I would agree. And the whole thing about, looking at monopolies is you're only concerned about them, not so much from an economic point of view, but from the point of view that concentration of economic power ultimately will lead to political power, and really looking at economic concentration is a political matter, not a purely economic matter. So why has there been so much industry concentration that I showed you on the earlier charts? Does it contribute to rising inequality, and does it really matter? Well, what you saw in 1975 was they changed the fair trading laws, where a mum and pop store and a chain store like Walmart had to be given the same wholesale price by a branded manufacturer who could set retail prices. And these were state laws. They were exempted from anti-monopoly for the idea, stemming back to 1931 in California, that you wanted to try and avoid domination, of the retail market by big companies. And there was a famous grocery chain called A&P, which was never even 1/5 of the size of Walmart, and that was always blocked by doing takeovers because they just felt it was better to have a broadly spread ownership in the retail sector, because if not, branded manufacturers, once retail concentrated, would be forced to concentrate to try and take back bargaining power. And Gerald Ford signed off this in 1975, and it was just interesting, Walmart, in January 1976, was worth $150 million. Today it's worth about $240 billion, I think $233 billion last night. The majority owners, the 5 children of Sam Walton, brilliant businessman, richer than the bottom 30-40% of Americans, depending on who you talk to, Steve Forbes or Bernie Sanders. It's a great success story. I mean, quite frankly, every business owner who got wiped out because he was uncompetitive versus Walmart should have put what was left of his money into Walmart shares, because they've done 20% compound since 1976. Excluding dividends, so quite extraordinary. Now, Senator Warren would say, they're amazing. They deliver anything from 30 to 50% of the groceries to American consumers, but they're not paying incredibly well. In fact, they don't. They probably pay, let's say, competitive wages that result in the need for Walmart workers alone to get about $6 billion in federal aid in terms of food stamps and Medicaid every year. So that just happens to equal the annual dividends paid by Walmart, which I think is a bit like black comedy, really, because I don't know if the Waltons really need the federal government to give $6 billion a year to their employees. So how did the big change happen? Well, there was a guy called Robert Bork, who was a University of Chicago law professor, quite brilliant. He wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox, and he really focused on anti-monopoly, antitrust, saying, look, all you care about is consumer welfare. If two companies are going to merge, if consumer prices are not going to go up in the short term, then it doesn't really matter, because it's all about efficiency. And this doctrine became, very, very popular with both Democrats and Republicans, because consumers had been excited by Ralph Nader in the 60s, and the Democratic Party saw this consumer welfare as being a bit like Ralph Nader, so they jumped on it as well. And it was adopted by Ronnie Reagan, elected in November 1980, early 81, appointed William Baxter head of the Antitrust, Anti-Monopoly Division of the Department of Justice, and he just said he's going to ignore all the judicial precedent from the US Supreme Court since 1890. He's just going to focus on economic efficiency. And even Dillon Read, a major investment bank at that time, forecast a big lift in merger activity. So what they did was simply change the guidelines at the DOJ. So they didn't change the law. They just said, well, if it doesn't look like a merger or takeover is offending, is going to impact consumer welfare, why would you care? And more cleverly, there's still a bunch of federal judges who've been, deciding cases for years and years and years. And what they did with them was took them on junkets to Arizona and Florida, played golf, casinos, whatever, and they attended seminars where they were taught the Bork, Chicago Doctrine, that unless consumer prices were going to be immediately raised, it was fine, it was good. And by the early 1990s, just one of these programs had indoctrinated 2/3 of the federal judges. So by the early 1990s, really, even if you get the Department of Justice to bring an antitrust case, you're going to be in front of a judge who's been on a golfing junket and has been taught that the only thing that counts is the Chicago Doctrine. So thus you saw the Sherman Act, which dates to the 1890s, the sort of investigations drop because it became popular to not stop mergers and takeovers, and concentration didn't matter. So, and then you see in the 90s, in fact, Clinton turns out to be a bigger monopolist than anybody under Reagan, and you can see the rising concentration industry and the falling enforcement. So has that really made a difference? And I thought we should focus on the internet to see if there's been any impact, on potentially inequality or how companies can compete. And it's interesting to look at Google. What you find with monopolies is they downplay their power. So if you Google's market share, then what you find is they've got 63% market share, but the actual number is 95%. So it's just sort of, it's funny. I think a lot of this is just black comedy. And surely, really, isn't Google good for producers? People who are original, who are innovative, who produce. Well, consumer spending on recording music is now down 71% because they changed the way that you can use other people's content on the internet. All the streamers in 2015 actually paid less revenue than vinyl LPs did. YouTube's got 52% market share in streaming music, but only pays 13% of streaming revenues. And one of the YouTube founders, Chad Hurley, was quoted as saying, back in '05, a way to avoid the copyright bastards might be to remove the no copyrighted or obscene material line and let the users moderate the videos. And this will make it better for us because we'll make the case they have the tools to do it. It's nothing to do with us. So, I mean, we all, let's be frank, on a Saturday night, you can run a dinner party off YouTube music, So, I mean, I'm a sinner, like everybody else. But even if Google's a monopoly, it's all fair competition, surely. Well, they're doing unbelievably well in capturing advertising. Obviously, newspapers have collapsed in terms of advertising, partly because a lot of them were too slow until probably people like Fairfax with Domain have finally done to do something. And I think what people don't understand is Lazard, vice chairman, making a comment about the data. Is your private data actually something you can alienate? Is that something, no matter, it's like you can't sell yourself into slavery. Can you give away your private data? Because, everybody feels Google's free, but what happens to your private data is it's taken away and it's sold to advertisers. So those advertisers are people who sell you products and services. So do they do it for free too, or is it reflected in the consumer prices? So, it's not. All this stuff is not free. At some point you pay for it, which, even Warren Buffett feels that, obviously it's a natural monopoly. I hold Google, I hold all, it's Alphabet now, but I hold all these stocks because I love businesses that create near monopoly positions because they tend to have super profits. So Google's winning on merit alone, aren't they? I mean, the EU antitrust, anti-monopoly fined Google $2.4 billion, partly because if you look for comparison shopping on Google, they'll push to Google Plus user reviews rather than what the normal organic historic algorithm of Google would send you to, which is a competitor comparison shopping site. And there was an antitrust, anti-monopoly probe by the Department of Justice into Google, and they dropped it. Now, coincidentally, Google staffers had 427 meetings at the White House during the course of the Obama presidency. I mean, 8 years, do the numbers, it's quite a lot. And the top lobbyists visited the White House. This is not regulators, this is not the DOJ, this is the Obama White House 128 times. So Obama's a good guy, but he's a monopolist too. So, nothing's really changed. So the antitrust probe was dropped. And none of the techs, as I say, are relying on increasing lobbying, are they? Well, I don't know. It looks like they're spending a lot on lobbying every year. So if it was just innovation, you'd say, how could we possibly, find this offensive? But why do they have to spend so much money on lobbying if it's purely based on competition, efficiency, and innovation? It sort of raises a question mark. And guess who Google paid to write their defence? Mr. Bork himself. So it's but seriously, isn't Bork right? What's the big deal? Surely all that counts is Barry Lynn, who was at the New America Foundation, who writes a lot about anti-monopoly. In fact, a lot of the ideas that Matthew Siegel writes about come from Barry Lynn. When he posted a congratulations in August to the EU, saying, good for you, someone's finally doing something about abuse of market position. What he forgot was Eric Schmidt's Family Foundation was a big contributor to the New America Foundation. And coincidentally, no link with Eric Schmidt, Barry Lynn was fired from his job at the end of August at the New America Foundation. So now he's running an independent organisation. But this is no reflection on Eric Schmidt or the fact New America took money from anybody related to Google. It's just a complete coincidence. Just going on, Facebook with fake news, it's interesting, if you look at total jobs, they've been rising in the States. News analysts, reporters, correspondents, it's been dropping. Now, probably I'm a bit nostalgic about that because I'm a former journalist, but it's interesting. If you look at Facebook, a lot of Facebook, it does many things. It's a great platform, but it's a bit, if you think of the West Australian newspaper, imagine a newspaper where there was only letters to the editor and lots of ads. No journalists employed. And no one reads those letters to the editor to see if they're libelous, slanderous, sexually or racially or whatever offensive. What kind of newspaper do you end up with? Unfortunately, you end up with Russian fake news going on to Facebook and other sites where Hillary Clinton was supposed to be associated with a pizza parlor in Baltimore that was linked to a pedophile ring, resulting in some crazy American turning up with a gun. So, at some point, Mr. Zuckerberg, who's now saying, okay, first he was quite dismissive of all these risks about fake news, and now he's saying, okay, I admit there's a problem. So, I suspect that these jobs are probably going to go like that because Mr. Zuckerberg's probably going to have to hire about 3,000 or 4,000 journalists to start curating what goes through Facebook. And, surely the taxpayers and physical retailers, didn't subsidise the growth of the internet platforms. I don't know. It's like, call me crazy. But were internet platforms paying sales tax when physical retailers were paying sales tax in the States, or were the physical retailers actually effectively, indirectly subsidising the growth of internet who had a cheaper price? Now, Amazon, I've got to say, my bottom line, Jeff Bezos is a genius. The man is just amazing. This is the most incredible company. But sometimes you sort of say, you just feel like saying to Jeff, why don't you just focus on Amazon? I mean, with Quidsy 2008, one of the fastest growing e-commerce companies, diapers.com, Pampers, Mr. Bezos' people made an offer. They said no. Consequently, Amazon then cut its own diaper prices by 30%. Quidsy started tracking when they varied prices. They could see Amazon was using its bot software to vary the price in reaction. Amazon launched Amazon Mum, apparently lost, which basically gave you free membership for 2 years, free delivery, even more discounts. None of this is illegal. It's just good, aggressive business. Amazon, the Quidsy guys, they believe probably lost $100 million in a quarter. Amazon went back to Quidsy and said, boys, have you understood? And so Quidsy sold out. Amazon Marketplace, third-party sellers use this Amazon Marketplace because it is the most amazing platform. There's more search on Amazon now than Google. In terms of fulfillment and getting your product to the market, even if you buy stuff on eBay, you'll find that companies often it'll turn up in an Amazon package. Because Amazon's been able to go out to UPS and DHL and negotiate 70% discounts, and if you're a small guy, forget it, you're never going to get a 70% discount out of FedEx or the like. Pillow Pets, which does sort of stuffed pillows with National Football League mascots, noticed that just before the holiday season, Amazon, using what we call featured placement on the website with their Amazon Basics private label, brought out a similar item, and Pillow Pets dropped 80% from the peak. They've got a unit at Amazon called Competitive Intelligence, and they look at fast-growing categories. And the Gazelle project was a very clever idea. That if you've got a herd of gazelles and you're two or three cheetahs, you go after the weak gazelle. So when you want to negotiate with the publishing industry, you go after the weakest publisher. You drive a hard deal, and you say, hey, boys, time to come to the table and talk about the deal. So, the Kindle bestseller, analysts think, was sold below cost. The Kindle itself, the bestsellers at $9.99 versus $12 to $30 for a hardback. And by 2009, they had 90% of the ebook market. They now have about 65% because Apple's there too. Forbes say the Kindle was sold below cost. It's a very hard thing to estimate because, when you look at volume and learning curve, you might lose money at the beginning. Your volume goes up, you have a lower cost. Amazon changes its prices at 2.5 million times a day. They know where you are when you want to buy something. If they wanted to do price discrimination, they could. Who knows if they do? But tailored pricing is no longer a hypothetical power. And what that means is when you walk into Coles or Woolies, you can see the price. But people think the internet is a great marketplace, but you can't see the price other people are getting. There's no chance you can see it. Even when you download an ebook off Kindle, I can see the price change depending on what address I'm using. Is it near Carnegie Hall, or is it in Geneva? So none of this is illegal. None of this is immoral. It's just very, very aggressive business. And Jeff Bezos is doing an amazing job. Cash flow growing at 45% per annum. So, my clients have made, 300% in the past few years on Amazon. So seriously, thank you, Mr. Bezos, but I don't know how long it goes on. They've started to use surge pricing so that, for example, in this example, this particular footwear deodorizer, when there's more inquiries, because there's social media campaigns or whatever, and you look at the retail price, it can be 100% higher. Depends on the rate of inquiry. So the price is varying according to inquiry. And interestingly, PC Magazine says, Amazon's got a lot of physical stores now. Now, a lot of people, when they go shopping, they get their cell phone out, they do comparison shopping, and they check, is that the best price, can I get a lower price? Now, Amazon has just patented a tech which will, in their physical stores, freeze your comparison shopping on your cell phone and using your GPS location, alert a sales rep to walk over to see you. So quite extraordinary. I mean, very innovative. So I think what the Bork doctrine ignored was, he felt that change shoe retailer to Pampers internet retailer. He said they can be driven out rapidly, like diapers.com, but re-entry will be equally rapid. I mean, seriously? Seriously? But the great one is, he said, look, you shouldn't be concerned about monopoly, even if you pay a higher price. Because you, the consumer, when you buy an article, when you buy it off that monopoly, you're forgetting that monopolies, that's owned by people too. And those people, yes, they're a lot richer than you, they are getting a benefit from you paying a higher price. So net, total consumer welfare is not changing, because, the Walton family might be getting the money instead of you, but, that is not a negative whatsoever. And I sort of wonder, are there any circumstances for Mr. Bork why this there might be a little touch negative? And he described predatory pricing generally as a phenomenon that does probably not exist. Now, anybody who's been in business knows you win customers with discounts at the beginning, and anybody who's done shopping knows that, they might have the Evian water, at $2.65 instead of $5.50, but they're getting it back somewhere else. I mean, it's really, and he thinks that below-cost pricing is irrational and rarely occurs. I mean, you've got to be kidding. And this idea, he says nobody would vertically integrate. You're a manufacturer of eyeglasses, for example. You want to build your position in the States. So you buy the retail chains, so that all that's left after you bought the retail chains is the mum and pop segment for about 25% of the total market. And then you can go to the last American manufacturer of glasses, and you can say, do you understand where you are? Like, if you want to sell anymore, you'd be selling at our price. And Luxottica, which has been a fabulous company out of Italy, this is what they did. They were able to do vertical integration because of changes in antitrust policy, and they now dominate the American market. Again, this is not a negative thing, but competition is obviously a lot less than it was. Now, Bork had always said that he didn't believe in leverage. He didn't believe big businesses would use their leverage. That leverage theory was rubbish. It didn't exist. But when he was retained by Netscape, the first browser company, to attack Microsoft's use of its Windows installed base to market the Internet Explorer, he described Microsoft's attempt to tie its operating system to its software as a way to leverage the Windows asset, to make people use Internet Explorer instead of Netscape's Navigator. So, when Bork's writing his theory, he says one thing, and when he's retained by Netscape, he says another. So, I think with Amazon, I think what they're going to face at some point is, people are going to sort of look at the banking analogy, and with banks, we don't like them being involved in anything but banking, because then they tend to steal money from the bank and put it into their own businesses. Whereas, Amazon is integrating vertically everywhere, and you just sort of wonder, if I was Mr. Bezos, I was saying, let's do that for as long as we can, because probably at some point, somebody's going to say, Jeff, I don't know that we're going to let you compete with your own customers. Like you're charging them, and then you're competing against them at the same time. So we'll see what happens. That may be a change that comes. So you wonder if this is Bork's legacy. The poor and middle classes in 1980 used to get the largest income growth. Now it's the 1,000th of 1% who obviously see the largest income growth, and you can see again that net worth of the middle class is dropping. So the question, there is capitalism, which is free market, and then there's rent seeking, where people can establish a monopoly and charge a perpetual rent for use of land. And what you can see is that in a small group of companies, they're getting a very, very relatively high return, which one's got to question, is that just innovation, or have they established a monopoly position as a consequence of all the concentration that's gone on? So that you've got a situation where the richest 62 people, this is Forbes magazine, wealthier than the bottom 50%, which again, it's not a negative, but what is it coming from? Is it coming from amazing innovation, or is it coming from concentration of ownership because nobody's stopped monopolies and they've established effectively monopoly positions? And CEOs used to be paid essentially something like a small multiple. It used to be probably 20 times the average salary, and today they've paid a huge proportion, higher than the average salary. I am not against people earning more money. I've been in banking all my life, but where is that coming from? And you can see even the concentration in asset management who invest in companies. Passive investment has taken off, which means the shareholder takes no interest at all in the company. And you can see when passive shareholding goes up, the CEO's salary goes up because the shareholders are asleep at the wheel. You can really increase your income. So the concentration in asset management itself and the concentration in industry is making it more difficult to make money in active funds management, which could just be life. This could be something that we live with forever. Or this could be a cycle, this could be a trend whose time is approaching an end if anti-monopoly law comes back. And I think what concerns me, I mean, if there wasn't obvious negatives, I wouldn't be against any of this, but what you can see is just this declining dynamism in startups, new business. At many points, more businesses closing down than starting. The startup decline down the bottom, since the 80s. Now, this is to a great extent due to a massive increase in regulation and the complex tax code, because there's 10 million words in the American tax code and the regulations. And I was having this debate with Mark Creasy, who Ron knows well. And Mark was saying, I think it's more regulation than the tax code that's killing small business. And that's true, but remember, big companies can navigate their way through. A national bank has endless numbers of compliance officers, where a small wealth management firm has to dedicate a significant percentage of their resources to coping with compliance. And to the point that, Mr. Malone, who runs Liberty, the media group, which is one of the 6 remaining big media groups in the United States, one of my colleagues from the bank who's an analyst in media, he was over visiting the headquarters. He had 2 floors dedicated to tax staff, including former senior IRS guys, the American equivalent of the ATO. So these guys have the resources, whereas, quite frankly, small business does not. And the other effect that you've seen is that 112 figure is it's actually 122, that it appears that corporate America seems to have cut R&D spending by about $122 billion a year. And, people like Boston Consulting Group are saying it's a great new model, operating margins are higher, people are spending less on R&D, but, we would say that potentially you may be eating the seed corn. And it's interesting that when you see American companies on the left, these are the ones that decided to continue to compete against China. And they are actually spending more on investment than the average company, and they're actually employing more people, incredibly. So what to do if we're worried about those trends? Maybe people are not, but a lot of people are. And this was the internet before Google and Facebook. That was, what telephone lines looked like, and electricity lines, And there were natural monopolies. A lot of things like Google and Facebook and Amazon particularly, are almost becoming natural monopolies, except in China, where the Chinese stopped them, and it's Alibaba and JD.com. So, what they did and is recognise that, sometimes it makes sense to allow companies to occupy these strong market positions, but you try and regulate them and you try to get them to continue to invest. And, that's just a list of, AT&T was regulated, but they had Bell Labs, which was required to spend money on R&D and license out their technology for a fee, obviously. And, these are all the things, amongst the things that Bell Labs invented over that period since regulation. And these patents helped create Texas Instrument, Fairchild Semiconductor, which is gone, Intel, Motorola, which is obviously, the shadow of what it used to be. So it was incredible that, the Bell Labs technology was not, in the end, built on a secret which lasted forever, which Google and Facebook algorithms appear to be. So it's interesting that about 2 weeks ago in Hong Kong at CLSA's investment forum, Steve Bannon made the comment, causing audible shudders from the globalist investment crowd, when he proposed that a decline in profit margins would be the necessary collateral damage from his proposed war on the elite. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about monopolists. He's not going after the rich. He's talking about, people who are using their position, to earn a rent, a excessive return based on abuse of a monopoly position. And when everybody groaned, he says, come on, there's more to life than MPV and IRR. And so there is emerging as I say, this is a trend change. You can see discussion on Facebook and about Facebook and Google and Amazon in the press, at least in the States. And this discussion is beginning. And I think otherwise there's sort of unhappy trends. I mean, you can see a lot of labour dropping out because, you know, what you earn at Walmart's not very interesting, so better on welfare. The red line is non-Hispanic white male deaths. So everywhere else in the world, it's been dropping, you know, for 15 years. Whereas in the United States, in actual fact, there's some sort of change. It's a bit like the post-Soviet Union, when, you know, white mortality, the white male life expectancy dropped, mortality rose. And, you know, mortality by poisoning in the non-Hispanic white group has just been exploding, and probably as a result of these opioids. You see, America is particular in this because it is a much more ruthless market. Australia controls its immigration. It hasn't had 40, 50 million of, you know, cheap labour coming in over the past 30, 35 years. And that, you know, we could go into that, but there's a small group of pharma companies that take doctors on conferences, and particularly doctors from lesser-known universities, and convince them to prescribe, you know, opioids, you know. And so there's about 5% of US physicians who've been taken to, you know, Florida golfing and now prescribe opioids. So politics, as we all know, has become more polarised, and we're not quite at this level. This discontinuity was World War II. We'd like to avoid that. Public trust in government has obviously been slumping for some time, and the partisanship, you know, the polarisation of the parties has obviously been increasing. So hopefully it doesn't lead to rising violence, you know, which unfortunately it is. I mean, that's obviously, militarised police forces with the Black Lives, you know, Matter protesters. That's Charlottesville, the white supremacists on the right, and Antifa, the Marxist leftists on the left, you know, coming along with their friendly baseball bats and helmets. And obviously continued racial unrest in the States, they keep on going. So I don't like left or right, and my youngest daughter got this off Instagram and sent it to me after Charlottesville. And talking about extremists, she said, you know, people seem confused about the Nazi issue, so I made a handy flowchart. Are Nazis bad? Yes. So that would be good if we could avoid all this, because just if we go back to the end of the 60s, you had the Weathermen Underground, who were anarchist extremists. You had the Black Panthers. You know, you had cities on fire in Chicago, East LA, etc. You know, Harlem. You had bombing. You know, you had the Kent State shootings, which 500 colleges were closed. Really, this would be good to avoid it. So you could be gloomy. Matthew Siegel says he thinks Molotov cocktail throwing is likely to increase in the States. I think people have got a lot at stake. You know, if you're wealthy in America, you've got a lot at stake. So why wouldn't you be intelligent about this, like Joe Kennedy, the father of JFK, who correctly saw that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, in 1932 would save capitalism, not destroy it, and he said he was happy to gamble half his fortune on the New Deal, taxes partly, if that meant he could keep the other half. He wanted power, you know, by virtue of his financial success, as well as security, which Roosevelt could guarantee. And it's interesting, you know, President Eisenhower, in his closing address when he retired, Kennedy was elected in November 60. He in early 61 made this address. And this is a guy who was he was the commander-in-chief of Allied forces in World War II in Europe. One of the most senior generals, most senior military people, and he said, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And he was talking about the military-industrial complex in the United States, who I think were pretty glad that the States won the Vietnam War because they made a lot of money. And all I would say is it's not only the military-industrial complex where you need to watch collusion and monopoly. You need to be attentive to companies abusing their position. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you know, in his 1938 speech to Congress, he said, the enforcement of free competition is the least regulation business can expect. And I just feel this is a trend change. You know, we've done 36 years with the Bork Doctrine. We now have some sign that regulation and tax code complexity is affecting small business dynamism, who are being affected by the concentration of ownership in business, and this is having a somewhat negative outcome on inequality. And it's not the only cause, but it may be, well, a major cause. And we see that there's a populist tone to politics which People like Steve Bannon clearly are leading, and I would predict that anti-monopoly law will change completely in the next few years. And people say, well, not under Trump. Well, Trump's neither a Democrat or a Republican. He just wants to do whatever will keep him there and maybe one day make him popular. So it's something that could happen more quickly than we think, and particularly when you see what Zuckerberg is saying in Washington at the moment. So we shall see. Thank you.